Hello everybody, this is Mark Blanton from the Real South Africa.
And I am Latasha Blanton, also with the Real South Africa.
And you guys are welcome to sunny South Africa. If this is your first time, this is your opportunity to come with Phil Scott with his channel.
And they will be here on March 16th through the 25th, 2022. The cost does include the flight, most meals, and your domestic flight in country from Johannesburg to Cape Town. The cost is $5,500 per person sharing and $6,150 for a person wanting a single room.
Now, at this point, you don't need any extra shots. The only thing you need to do is have a negative COVID test prior to you leaving. And then, of course, upon departure, we will get you another COVID test. And then that's it. So that's really all you need. And, of course, a passport.
So no shots, no vaccines, no nothing. Just get to South Africa. We'll see you here.
Yes, welcome back to the one and only African Diaspora News channel. My name is Richard Sudan. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe and support the platform. So a very quick video I want to make for you today on a very specific subject, and that subject is the legal and moral right for African American descendants of slaves or foundational Black Americans to receive reparations for the Black Holocaust and the crime of slavery. Now, I posed the question yesterday on social media, and the question was really regarding the bill to study reparations, which has basically stalled in the United States Congress and the Senate. And the bill, of course, is to study reparations, and what that may entail is anyone's guess. And of course, it's basically ground to a halt, and it's ground to a halt not least because you'll remember at the last election, reparations was really talked up. There was a lot of feigned, what I would say fake support, the suggestions that the Democrats and others and Joe Biden welcomed the idea of reparations. But of course, ever since Joe Biden got the keys to the White House, that question has fallen off the agenda, and I believe it needs to remain firmly on the agenda. Now, the question I tweeted yesterday was regarding this bill in Congress to study reparations. My question was, how much studying do you think there was done before the decision was made to compensate slave owners? How much studying do you really think was needed before that process began? Now, some of you will probably know the answer to that question. Some of you won't, but I just want to bring this to people's attention. Britain officially ended slavery in its entirety in 1833. The slave trade itself had been outlawed since about 1807. So you had the slavery outlawed in 1833, and pretty much in the very same breath, the same year, the process began to compensate slave owners. And within a year or two, the Slave Compensation Act, or it was called something like that, the Slavery Compensation Act was passed, and this was passed to compensate slave owners. Now, Britain decided to compensate close to 50,000 slave owners who had owned slaves previously in the colonies. Now, the sum in 1833 or in the 1830s, you're talking 20 million pounds, which in today's money ran into the billions, the tens of billions. Now, this act was passed pretty much in a heartbeat. When you look at the end of slavery and when this act was passed, there's about 2 or 3 years between the end of slavery and the actual act being passed by Parliament. But the actual process to compensate slave owners began almost immediately. And so large was the sum that the British government committed to slave owners that at the time it represented about 40% of the government's total annual budget for that year. And so large was the sum, and because of the way that the kind of economic and political system works here, that actually the UK taxpayer only finished off paying off that sum in 2015. So it really shows you when there's the political will, these people, these institutions, these governments can whistle up the money they want in a heartbeat. We're always told when it comes to the question of reparations for African American descendants of slaves, you know, one of the things you hear among the talking points is, you know, where's the money going to come from? But the United States, just like the United Kingdom, has billions and trillions to whistle up. endless money for wars of attrition, wars for resources, wars in countries where Britain and America have no place to be. And I say Britain because I'm a firm believer, actually. We hear about the American government, the demands for the American government to compensate African American descendants of slaves, but the UK government and others are culpable too. But certainly the UK government is definitely culpable. And so we see this excuse peddled out time and time again. There's no money, but we know there is the money. There is the money. And there were, all sorts of families that were actually compensated for their loss of property at the end of slavery. Former UK Prime Minister David Cameron, his family, there was somebody called Sir James Duff, who is one of David Cameron's direct descendants. He was one of those compensated for his loss of property. So they can whistle up the money whenever they want. And actually, so staunch was the commitment to compensate slave owners. As I say, the money that was allocated by the UK government, the Treasury had to borrow this massive sum from the Bank of England. It represented nearly half of the government's total annual budget for that year, and they rustled up the money. And actually, in the same way, slavery built the kind of modern banks, the insurance companies, all sorts of businesses, museums, universities, all kinds of institutions. The money that was allocated to compensate slave owners, again, lined the pockets of many notable families, including, I think, also the family of George Orwell. And these sums of money were so vast that they created a kind of intergenerational balance of wealth. In other words, this wealth was able to continue to last within these families for generations and generations and generations, and continues to permeate a wealth gap between some of the most wealthy and some of the most impoverished. And likewise, you have a similar situation in the United States. And it really gets to me how the question of reparations for foundational Black Americans is treated as an endless talking point, an endless kind of point of intellectual discussion. And it's kind of ironic. A lot of the people that endlessly want to talk about slavery went to the very universities. For example, they went to the very universities which were founded off the back of free labor forced from slaves. And of course, people always talk about the system, but Black people were the original capital in the United States. There would be no United States if it wasn't for the free labor of African American descendants of slaves. And I think it's morally outrageous that these politicians can talk about reparations at election time and they can court everyone's vote. They can use it as a sort of carrot to dangle at people just to get people to come out and support them. And I hope to see a real shift in this dynamic, because all across the West, all across sort of developed, so-called developed liberal democracies, you've got not only Black self-determination treated as a sort of hindrance to kind of the system or class struggle, as some like to frame it. They really take the Black vote for granted. They take and have taken and will continue to take that vote for granted. So reparations needs to be treated seriously. It needs to be forced back onto the political agenda. And in the UK too, you've had one prime minister after another always completely ignore the question of reparations. David Cameron went to Jamaica, I think it was in 2015, and he essentially told Jamaicans to get over slavery. He told Jamaica to move on from slavery. So not only was Britain a country which was industrialized off the forced labor of African slaves in the Caribbean and its colonies, to rub salt into the wound, David Cameron's own family were a direct beneficiary of the reparations which were allocated to slave owners. And again, you sort of hear, when it comes to Black people in the US, you hear the idea of reparations treated as some sort of a political talking point. But we know for a fact that many other groups were compensated for the historic wrongs committed against them, by the British government, and then following that the American government, so on and so forth. So don't ever let them tell you there's no money for reparations. There is the money, there lacks the political will, but that's because they take black people's votes and they take black people in general for granted in the United States. I do personally believe this situation will change. I think there's a growing movement amongst new black media that are really starting to shape people's consciousness, starting to bring this issue of reparations onto the agenda once more. And that's exactly where it should be. And I actually agree with Dr. Claude Anderson, who I've been starting to read some of his works of late. I think not only is it a kind of legal and moral right for African Americans to receive reparations, I don't really see how America is going to function in its current form unless there's a system of justice replacing the system that's there at the moment. And actually, one thing Dr. Claude Anderson also says is that black people will not be able to compete in the United States. The way the system is structured, other groups coming in, other groups getting benefits, at the expense of the group which has been there the longest, which is of course African Americans, black people, African American descendants of slaves. They will not be able to compete as a group unless reparations are given. And reparations is possible. I mean, there's a lot of debate about how much money should be paid. From what I can see, it ranges between sort of, I don't know, maybe 15 trillion up to 50 trillion. There's debate about this, but it definitely runs into the trillions. And don't forget that the US's war and occupation of Afghanistan, which only ended recently, that in itself cost a couple of trillion. But the British government, which also owes money to foundational black Americans, they were willing to incur a debt from 1833 up until 2015 in order to compensate the families, institutions and slave owners that profited from human capital, from the free labor, the extracted free labor of slavery at the time. And of course, we're really not talking that long ago. It sounds long ago, but you're talking really a few lifetimes back. 1833 is not as long back as we really think it is. This is like 3 or 4 people ago. It's not that long. And the lasting legacy of this system, which I would really say, I call it a black Holocaust. The lasting legacy of this system, we see the ramifications of this kind of ripple effect all across the country in the United States. But don't let Britain get away from the question of reparations. Britain needs to pay reparations to foundational black Americans too. It's not a question of whether they should. I view this as I always say, not just a moral question. This is a legal question. Other groups have been compensated, and it's time for foundational black Americans to be compensated too. And that's the only way really that there's going to be some sort of longevity in the American system as we see it, because the kinds of rifts, the kinds of issues we saw come to the fore over the last couple of years, these issues are not going anywhere. We've just passed the 1-year mark from where Joe Biden did absolutely nothing specifically for foundational black Americans. He signed, I remember, a bunch of executive orders for all sorts of groups, but he's done nothing to back up his promise when he said famously upon winning the election, "Black America, you've always had my back and I'll have yours." Of course, we all know Joe Biden's actual record regarding black America. So I hope and I pray and I want to see the issue of reparations forced back onto the agenda. And not only that, I want to see it become so powerful as a kind of political movement that it's forced back onto the agenda and it actually starts to happen. Because this bill, which has been stalled in Congress, in the Senate, it's not going to go anywhere. I think it's just almost designed to create an endless discussion about studying reparations. And as we can see from the Slave Compensation Act in Britain in the 1830s, not much studying was needed to decide to compensate slave owners. And it's time this historic wrong, which has massive implications for today, is corrected once and for all. So that's my 2 cents on the issue. Thank you very much for tuning in. Let me know what you think about this subject in the comments. No doubt we'll see you again soon. My name is Richard Sudan. This is the African Diaspora News channel, and we will see you very soon.
Colonization never ended in the white supremacist system. And as we see today, the colonization is in the mind. Now, those who have been enslaved and those who have been colonized, we're still dealing with the remnants of that through the colonization of the mind. Pick up my book, 7 Steps to Decolonize the Mind, and we will help deprogram you from the colonization that was put upon you by generations and generations of white supremacy. You can pick it up today on Amazon.com.